For more than a century, one of the most visited objects in any museum on Earth has been presenting the world with a face that was never meant to be the final truth. The bust of Nefertiti, housed in the Neues Museum in Berlin and protected behind glass from the more than 500,000 visitors who come to see it annually, has been treated as the definitive image of an ancient Egyptian queen, the most reproduced face from the ancient world, a standard of beauty cited across more than 3,000 years of subsequent human history. Art historians have written entire careers around it. Tourists photograph it from every angle. The long neck, the elegant bone structure, the painted eye, the missing left eye that somehow makes the image more rather than less compelling. These features have become so culturally embedded that most people treat the bust as though it were a window directly onto the face of a real woman who lived in the 14th century before the Common Era. What a CT scanning team discovered when they looked inside that object in 2009 fundamentally changes what the bust actually is. There is a second face inside it. It was carved by the original sculptor, hidden under layers of plaster, and it looks nothing like the one the world has been admiring. The implications of that discovery go far beyond one object in one museum. They reach into the most turbulent and deliberately obscure decade in ancient Egyptian history, and they raise questions about what was being hidden and why that the physical evidence alone cannot fully answer. The discovery of the bust itself has a history worth understanding before examining what the scan revealed. In 1912, a German archaeological expedition led by Ludwig Borchardt was excavating at Tel El Amarna, the site of the ancient city known as Akhenaten, built by the pharaoh Akhenaten in the middle of his reign as the physical expression of his radical religious revolution. Among the structures uncovered was the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose, and within that workshop, lying on its side in the rubble, was the painted limestone bust now in Berlin. No inscription identified the subject. No royal cartouche was present. The identification with Nefertiti, Akhenaten's great royal wife, came through decades of comparative analysis with relief carvings from the Amarna period that showed the same facial features, the same distinctive crown, and the same stylistic treatment of the figure. The scholarly consensus that the bust depicts Nefertiti has been broadly accepted, though not universally, and the questions surrounding its creation and purpose have never been fully resolved. Borchardt removed the bust to Germany under the terms of a division agreement with Egyptian authorities, a removal that has been disputed by Egypt ever since, and it has remained in Berlin despite repeated formal requests for its return. The CT scanning that revealed the hidden inner face was conducted by a team from the Charité Medical University in Berlin and reported in the journal Radiology in 2009. The technology used was computed tomography, which fires X-rays through an object from multiple angles and reconstructs a three-dimensional image of its interior without any physical intervention. The same technology is used routinely in medical imaging, and its application to archaeological objects has transformed what researchers can learn about ancient artifacts without risking damage to them. When the scan of the Nefertiti bust was processed, it revealed that the object has a two-layer structure, a limestone core and an outer plaster coating, and that the surface of the limestone core is not simply rough material waiting for the plaster to give it shape. It is a fully finished, carefully executed portrait face, different in significant ways from the plaster face that has been visible to the world for over a century. The differences between the inner limestone face and the outer plaster face are specific and meaningful. The inner face shows a sharper nose with a small bump on the bridge. It shows slight creases at the corners of the mouth and subtle hollows beneath the cheekbones, signs of age or individuality that the outer face smoothed away entirely. The cheekbones in the inner face sit differently. The overall impression is of a real person, with the specific features that real people have, the asymmetries and variations that result from actual bone structure rather than idealized geometric proportion. The outer plaster face is perfectly symmetrical in ways that human faces almost never are. It is not aged. It carries no marks of lived time. Whatever the sculptor started with, a faithful likeness of a specific person, was then covered with a version of that person that served a different purpose entirely. The archaeologist and art historian Dietrich Wildung, former director of the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, has stated that the inner face is more individualistic and suggests a specific real person, while the outer surface represents the idealized official portrait. Those two sentences, read together, describe something that the word retouching does not adequately cover. The sculptor was not correcting errors. He was constructing a different person on top of the person he had actually observed and faithfully rendered. To understand why this matters beyond the immediate technical interest of finding one layer of material inside another, it is necessary to understand the specific historical context in which this object was made. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of Akhenaten, a pharaoh who undertook the most radical religious revolution in the 3,000-year history of Egyptian civilization. Akhenaten dismantled the established priestly hierarchies that had governed Egyptian religious life for centuries, closed the temples of the traditional gods, stripped the priesthood of Ammonius of its enormous wealth and authority, and declared that the only legitimate object of worship was the Aten, the visible solar disk, and that he and Nefertiti were the sole human intermediaries between the Aten and the Egyptian people. He then moved the royal capital from Thebes to a newly constructed city in the desert, called Akhetaten, built from nothing on land that had no previous sacred associations, and that was therefore not already claimed by any competing religious institution. Everything about this program was deliberate and systematic, and it required sustained ideological support to maintain against the resistance of a priestly establishment that had been enormously powerful before Akhenaten began dismantling it. Nefertiti's role in this program was not secondary. The relief carvings that survive from the Amarna period show her in positions of religious and political authority that had no precedent for an Egyptian queen. She appears performing sacred rituals beside Akhenaten, worshipping the Aten in the same posture and scale as the king. More strikingly, some relief carvings from the period show her alone, depicted in the pose of smiting enemies, a posture specifically reserved for the pharaoh in Egyptian iconographic tradition, conveying sovereign power and divine authority. She is shown wearing a unique crown that appears nowhere else in Egyptian art. She was, in the visual language of the Amarna period, being presented as a co-ruler, a partner in the divine authority that the new religious order claimed for the royal couple. The bust, found in the workshop of the royal sculptor, was almost certainly a master template, a reference model from which copies would be made for distribution throughout the empire, ensuring that every Egyptian who encountered an image of Nefertiti encountered the same image. In that context, the choice to cover the faithful inner portrait with an idealized outer surface was not an aesthetic preference. It was a political decision about what the face of power should look like when it needed to command the loyalty of a population that had just been told to abandon every god it had ever known. The disappearance of Nefertiti from the historical record around the 12th year of Akhenaten's 17-year reign is one of the most debated questions in Egyptology. She was omnipresent in the records of the early Amarna period and then simply ceases to appear. No death record has been found. No confirmed tomb has been identified. The simplest explanation, that she died of illness or plague, as many people did in the ancient world, cannot be ruled out, but the archaeological evidence has consistently generated more complicated possibilities. Egyptologist James Allen, whose work on this question has been among the most careful and extensively documented in the field, has argued through detailed analysis of royal cartouches, grammatical structures, and the specific feminine endings on royal titles that a ruler appearing in the records near the end of Akhenaten's reign under the name Nefertiti was Nefertiti herself, having assumed sovereign power under a new royal identity. The evidence Allen and other scholars have assembled includes the grammatical feminization of titles that would have been masculine for a male ruler, specific epithets that link Nefertiti to Nefertiti, and the positioning of this ruler within the chronological sequence of the late Amarna period. If this identification is correct, Nefertiti did not vanish from history. She became pharaoh. And then, after her rule ended, her name was systematically removed from the records in exactly the way that the records of other politically inconvenient rulers were managed in ancient Egypt. The evidence of deliberate erasure is not in dispute. It is physically present on surviving monuments. At multiple temple complexes dating to the final years of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti's name was chiseled out of inscriptions and replaced with another name. This was not random damage. It was targeted, systematic, and carried out across multiple locations. The pattern is consistent with what happened to other rulers whose existence later Egyptian governments wished to minimize. Most famously Akhenaten himself, whose monuments were destroyed and whose name was removed from the official king lists after his death, an attempt to erase the entire Amarna period from the historical record. That Nefertiti received similar treatment suggests that whoever carried out the erasure considered her legacy equally dangerous or inconvenient to whatever political and religious order was being established in the years following Akhenaten's death. The genetic evidence that has emerged from analysis of royal mummies adds another dimension to this question that the documentary and archaeological evidence alone cannot provide. The 2022 study published in the journal Nature, the same research project that analyzed multiple royal mummies from the New Kingdom period using advanced ancient DNA sequencing techniques, produced results relevant to the question of Nefertiti's fate through the analysis of a mummy from the Valley of the Kings designated KV21b. This mummy was determined through mitochondrial DNA analysis to share maternal lineage with Tutankhamun, placing her within the immediate royal family of the Amarna period. The candidates consistent with that genetic relationship and with the archaeological context include Nefertiti herself, though the identification is not confirmed and continues to be debated within the field. What the forensic analysis of KV21b revealed beyond the genetic data was disturbing in its implications. The mummy showed evidence of significant physical trauma, fractures consistent with violent injury rather than the gradual damage of structural collapse, injuries to the arms and ribcage that forensic analysis suggested may have occurred near the time of death. Dr. Sahar Salim of Cairo University, who led the radiological analysis of the royal mummies as part of the Egyptian Mummies Project, has published her findings with appropriate scientific caution, but the injuries she documented do not fit the pattern of post-mortem damage and require explanation. The theory advanced by British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, that Nefertiti's tomb may be hidden behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings, remains one of the most discussed propositions in contemporary Egyptology despite the contested radar evidence. Reeves published his detailed analysis in 2015, based on high-resolution scans of the tomb's walls that revealed what he interpreted as sealed doorways plastered over and painted to match the surrounding decoration. His broader argument, that the tomb of Tutankhamun was originally excavated for someone else and that the young king was buried in an outer chamber after his unexpected death while the inner chambers remained sealed with their original occupant, draws on the tomb's unusual proportions, its non-standard layout compared to other royal tombs of the period, and the evidence of hasty adaptation visible in the burial equipment. Radar surveys conducted by a Japanese research team in 2016 appeared to support the existence of anomalies behind the northern wall. A subsequent Italian survey in 2018 reached different conclusions. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities has not authorized physical investigation of the wall, and the question therefore remains technically unresolved, though Reeves continues to maintain his position. The daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti provide yet another layer of the erasure. 6 princesses are depicted consistently throughout the surviving art of the Amarna period: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesempeten, Neferneferutin Tasheret, Neferneferur, and Setapenra, present in family scenes, religious ceremonies, and official depictions throughout the earlier years of the reign. After the 12th year, they begin disappearing from the record one by one, with no consistent explanations surviving in the texts. Meketaten appears to have died during the reign, memorialized in a relief carving from the royal tomb at Amarna that shows her parents in grief, one of the most emotionally direct images in ancient Egyptian art. Ankhesempeten survived long enough to be married to Tutankhamun after the collapse of the Amarna period, appearing in the historical record under the name Enkhesenamen. After Tutankhamun's death, she wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma requesting that he send a son for her to marry, stating in the letter, preserved in Hittite archives, that she was afraid and had no son. The Hittite prince sent in response was killed before reaching Egypt, almost certainly on the orders of the military commander Horemheb, who had his own plans for the succession. Enkhesenamen then disappears from the record entirely. The bust stands in Berlin, admired by the same number of visitors every year, still presenting the face that the sculptor built on top of the face he had actually observed. The world has spent more than a century treating the outer plaster surface as a window onto a historical person, and in a sense it is. But the historical person it reveals is not the woman who actually lived in Akhetaten in the 14th century before the Common Era. It is the image that someone in power needed the world to see. The CT scan that revealed the inner limestone face gave us, briefly, access to something that was supposed to remain hidden. A sculptor's honest observation, covered over with official perfection, waiting in darkness for 3,000 years. The woman inside that plaster, with her slightly irregular nose and the fine lines at her mouth corners, is more interesting than the idealized face above her. She is what the propaganda was built to conceal. And the rest of her story, the systematic erasure of her name, the transfer of her legacy, the physical fate of a body that may or may not carry her DNA, suggests that concealment was not limited to the surface of one object in a sculptor's workshop. It was the organizing principle of how an entire era of Egyptian history was managed after the people who shaped it could no longer defend themselves.